Welcome back to the channel, everybody. We got part 2 of the Cold War Oversimplified. This is our second war video that we're doing.
Yes.
We did World War II, and now we're wrapping up the Cold War, and we've really enjoyed the Oversimplified videos that we've been checking out thus far, right?
Yeah, these have been awesome.
Yeah, so we're doing part 2 on this one. If you haven't watched part 1, I'll make sure that we have a video link up there for you. You can click that and go watch that first before you watch this one. And we plan to do more in the future. So if you want to give us any recommendations for stuff you'd like to see, then we appreciate your insights. Other than that, are you ready to check out the second half? Because I think we did the first half of the Cold War. So I think we have another like 25 years to go. You ready to check out the back end?
Yes, let's do it.
Let's roll.
Two months for free. For anyone who thinks recent US history has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you the 1960s, extreme cultural division, major political assassinations, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. Shocked by the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, a certain Fidel Castro met with a certain Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City, and the two of them decided they should grow some awesome beards and overthrow the Cuban government, which is exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a communist regime being set up in its own backyard. So the US immediately began training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, Kennedy wanted to conceal any US involvement in the plan, so he massively scaled back American air support, and as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat for America. But Castro felt there was still an impending US threat to his regime. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a lot of medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America, but they could if they were positioned, say, on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida. Hey, I'm a communist who hates America. You're a communist who hates America. You know what that means? We should fall in love. I was just gonna suggest you set your missiles up in Cuba. Oh, no, you're right. That's a better idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba noticed something strange. Sir, you need to look at this photograph. You're right. That's the cutest dog I've ever seen. Sir, I was referring more to the Soviet missiles. America freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable, and they had to act fast. They knew that airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba would likely mean nuclear war with the Soviet Union, so Kennedy came up with another idea: a blockade. The US Navy announced it would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba, and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviet put its military into full combat readiness. The US did the same, and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications between the two sides broke down as Khrushchev rejected Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed. And for the first time in history, US Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and two of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the third senior officer, this beautiful man, refused to authorize the decision. The US finalized its preparations, and I kid you not, the day before the US were set to decide the day and time for the Cuban invasion, Khrushchev was like, hey, you know if you just removed your missiles from Turkey, we'd remove ours from Cuba? Yeah, that sounds good to me. It was a bit more complicated than that, but at the last second, the two sides...
That's so wild.
Yeah.
I had no idea that the world was that close.
No, I had no idea.
Based on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I had no idea about the submarine thing either.
No,
the Soviet
neither.
Union submarine.
I'd never
the
heard
guy
that.
is like the only
Literally
person.
one person was like, nope.
That's crazy to me that I have not heard that guy's name one time. And he literally could have avoided the world going into World War III.
Oh my gosh, it's crazy.
Hopefully there's another guy like that lying around right now today. And he'll be around when we need him.
Yeah.
Because we're kind of at that place now, it feels like a little bit. Anyways, it blew my mind. And then, like they were saying, one day away from the invasion as well of Cuba, which would have,
hey, by the way,
which would have totally set off a whole set of dominoes, right?
Yeah.
Crazy.
sides finally came to an agreement. Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba, and the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief. Except for one guy, who was bloody livid. Phew! Let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. Unfortunately for him, his presidency was to end with one. Having nearly blown up the planet, a few changes were made. First, the superpowers agreed to a limited test ban treaty. Secondly, the Soviets ousted Khrushchev and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a kisser. He liked to kiss. Both sides were deeply concerned at the prospect of nuclear war, but still, the arms race raged on throughout the 60s and 70s. US intelligence worked out that the Soviets' nuclear arsenal was not as powerful as they previously thought, but in fact, it was America that held the advantage. ABMs and MIRVs were developed, and the doctrine of MAD. If both sides knew they would be completely destroyed by a nuclear war, neither would risk starting one. But even without war, the world was already feeling the effects of nuclear weapons. In 1966, above the pleasant town of Palomares in Spain, a US bomber collided with a tanker mid-air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It hasn't exploded, so I'm sure everything's fine. Whoa, boy. Hey, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Okay. What were you gonna do today? Go for a swim? Yeah, I wouldn't. Are you breathing right now? Yeah? Yeah, I wouldn't. It took the Americans 2.5 months to find one of the bombs, which had gone missing in the ocean. This was the 14th time America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950. Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. So sleep well tonight. After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East, Vietnam. Back in the 50s, the Vietnamese had kicked their French colonizers out once and for all, and the country was divided into two. In the north, a communist regime, and in the south, an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Vietnam under their own regime. So the north established the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the south with Soviet support. The US sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese to deal with the threat, but President Diem's brutal policies pushed more and more South Vietnamese to support the Viet Cong. And over the next decade, the situation escalated to a breaking point. America feared the domino effect. That is, if South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand? Burma? India? LBJ had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops. And so in they went. From 1965, America found itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought before. Let's play Spot the Viet Cong Soldier. Did you see him? Of course not. That's because millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight a ruthless enemy who used the thick jungle as its shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was, or worse, who it was. And as a result, the civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire. The city of Saigon found itself under regular attack, and America launched a bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder. The Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia to supply the campaign. It was a long and brutal war, and I could never do it justice in this video. But in terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably the biggest of many global conflicts that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear war, the two superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive, and as a result, their ideological battle shifted away from the potential of direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the US backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw US-supported South Africans fighting Soviet-supported Cubans. In the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, the superpowers interestingly switched sides as regimes changed, and the US continued fighting the spread of communism in its own backyard, funding the famous Contra groups to fight the socialist junta in Nicaragua. These proxy wars were fierce enough to begin with, but superpower intervention amplified the destruction and created alarming levels of human suffering throughout the Third World. And in Vietnam, that human suffering was all being broadcast back home via good old television. Going into the late 60s, America was a changing.
So that's crazy to see the visualization of how much was going on,
Yeah, and all those
especially
little mini wars.
the proxy wars, right?
Yeah.
And to me, although I understand the premise of it in this video, the Cold War and the idea of communism, and trying to combat that from the Western point of view, I also believe that these two forces, being the Soviet Union and US, probably had a lot of profiteering going on from the wars that were taking place, right?
Yeah.
They weren't, as they alluded to, nuclear wars, which were going to annihilate each other, but war is still really profitable for the people that are pulling the strings and not having to go to war themselves, right? Which has always driven me nuts about war.
Yeah.
So, they have these defense contractors and everything else, probably from both sides, who, then are making these leaders potentially rich in more ways than, people know. And, all these proxy wars are just continuous. They're not going to cause the world to go into an influx and, become severely unstable, but it's going to cause enough, destruction and chaos that it is politically driven and driving so that there can be policies enacted from the home front, the domestic front, but also, like I said, it's going to create enough profit from people that want to get involved with it to fund both sides of the wars. And essentially that's what they were doing, right? One side would fund one side, and then the other side would fund the other side. And, you know, who knows where all the money was going. But that's just my thought process when I see all these proxy wars, especially related to what's going on today in the world. I feel like, you know, the reasons why are not clear. And although at the time it made it seem like it was communism, you know, as combating that as an idea, which would make sense on the heels of what we saw in the last video with, you know, the repercussions of the World War II and all that. I think there's probably more details that you can't encompass in an oversimplification video.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that, you know, like you said, it's like at some point, some of these people probably didn't even want the war to end because they were making so much money off of it, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Nation. This became this. This became this. And this became this. The new slogan that was taking root: make love, not war. The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War, and in 1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War appeared to be increasingly unwinnable, and public opinion turning increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home, and ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam by 1973. 2 years later, the South fell. The Cold War was now taking its toll on both superpowers. In Russia, a huge percentage of the budget was still going to the military. People were still hungry, and they just didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. And what did they have to show for it? They weren't even winning the space race anymore. Both sides needed to reduce spending in order to rescue their economies, and so both welcomed with open arms an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as Détente. To improve relations, Nixon became the first US president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev returned the gesture a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT agreement that limited nuclear weapons. Relations with China were even improving via ping-pong diplomacy when the US table tennis team went on a tour of the People's Republic. However, internally, China was still pushing anti-capitalist propaganda, which led to some mixed messages. Nixon even visited China in 1972, and it was a barrel of laughs.
Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
You put the stopper into his ears so that he couldn't hear the criticism.
Give me a pair as a gift.
他是不是给我一对啊？
Everything was going great for Nixon, until it was uncovered that back home he was being a very naughty boy and violating constitutional protocol. I'm announcing today my resignation as president, and I'm passing the office to my vice president, Gerald Ford. Wow, you mean in America that people can actually remove their leader when he breaks the law? Why not just rule by force? Where's the corruption? And my first act as president is to pardon Nixon. Ah, there it is. After the whole fiasco, Americans decided what they really wanted was just a nice, safe guy who wouldn't cheat on them. So they elected Jimmy Carter, and the two sides met in Vienna, where they signed yet another strategic arms limitation treaty. It's an honor, Premier Brezhnev. Likewise, President Carter. Please don't do that. But that's not to say there was no longer any tension between the two sides, because there was. Heaps of it. Once again, the Soviet Union put down further attempts at reform and rebellion in the Eastern Bloc. The Euro missile crisis saw new and improved classes of intermediate-range missiles being deployed in Europe. In 1979, the Soviets thought it would be a good idea if they had their own Vietnam and invaded Afghanistan to prevent a US-sponsored Islamic insurgency. And in response to these various crises, Olympic Games were boycotted. Conservatives were concerned that US policy had become too soft, and in 1980, they decided they wanted a president who would be tough on communism, so they elected Ronald Reagan. And Reagan came in guns blazing. Concerned at the Soviet Union's human rights violations, he made a speech calling them an evil empire. And he also wanted to renew the arms race using technological advances in computing and lasers. He came up with the Space Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which was basically a big defensive anti-nuke shield around the country. But a lot of people thought it was a pretty dumb idea. The Soviet Union perceived this shift in rhetoric as the USA getting ready for war, and they were feeling especially threatened as their relationship with their communist ally China had broken down. Relations took a big hit in 1983 when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner that had strayed into their airspace, and it looked like the world was going right back to mid-20th century Cold War tension. But then Brezhnev got really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and he was replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev. Coming into office in 1985, he was the real game changer. His philosophy differed a lot from previous Soviet leaders. He felt that the reason the Soviet system and economy was struggling was that it didn't allow the Soviet people to find satisfaction in their work, because they weren't allowed to speak freely and lived in fear. Gorbachev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but unlike previous Soviet leaders, he actually made the change happen. Within the first couple of years, he began the political movement for more openness and transparency, and the restructuring of the Soviet political and economic systems. And change very quickly took effect. People could criticize the government, they could enjoy Western pop culture, the media interviewed Margaret Thatcher, but most importantly, the Soviet people could now enjoy Pizza Hut. All hail to Gorbachev. He also knew that the arms race needed to end in order to rescue the Soviet economy, and a positive relationship with the West must be established. Constructive dialogue reopened and resulted in the INF Treaty, which saw all intermediate-range missiles eliminated, which was huge. Reagan's tone towards the Soviet Union began to soften, and things were looking up. But what would these reforms mean for the Eastern Bloc? For decades, the Soviets had been brutally suppressing any attempt at change. Now, would they be allowed? And that was the exact question on Hungary's lips when the Prime Minister visited Moscow. Gorbachev's response: he didn't necessarily agree with the reforms, but he wouldn't stop them either. He was prepared to let the Eastern Bloc choose its own future. This was massive, and the Hungarian leaders began planning free, multi-party elections. Poland followed suit, and also held elections in June. The anti-Soviet party, Solidarity, won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. But not just that. In Hungary, the barbed wire border between East and West was removed. The Iron Curtain was unraveling. But not all Eastern Bloc leaders were happy. Notably, East Germany was still ruled by a hardline Stalinist, Erich Honecker, and many East Germans were still eager to get out. They had been trapped by the Berlin Wall, but now they were doing the math. If they could travel to Hungary, and Hungary's border with the West was loosening, could they now make it to the West? That summer, East Germans decided Hungary was the latest top holiday destination. They traveled there in droves, and using various methods, tens of thousands crossed the border into Austria and the West. Honecker was furious and blocked travel to Hungary, but that civil liberties train had started rolling and it wasn't stopping. Thousands more flocked to the West German embassy in Prague, where they stormed the fence around the embassy gardens and a temporary refugee camp was set up. In September, deals were struck to allow the refugees to travel west via train. Back in East Germany, the people were running on a civil liberties high, and they wanted their next hit. Dissent was growing. Over time, demonstrations turned to mass protest, with plainclothes secret police officers doing their best to put down the dissent, but it had grown well out of their control, and worse.
So, a few things. First of all, it's crazy because I've heard the name Gorbachev before. Particularly, we discussed it a little bit when we were doing the song Scorpions, Winds of Change. We did that, and that was in reference to some of the communism that was going on.
Yeah.
And so, in light of Gorbachev, I do recall him being a prominent figure in the Soviet Union, no longer being what it was, and this kind of added a little more detail to the way that took place, and how much
kind of the chain of events,
how much a change in leadership can really change the direction of an entire country. And the weird circumstances of events that took place of having 3 leaders pass away very quickly in succession.
It seemed like it was in a really short period of time.
To get him in there, who knows if that was all by natural causes? I have no idea. But in Russia in particular, you never know, right? So then on top of that, we're talking about East and West Germany here, and it's pretty wild to see, so many people trying to get the hell out of there.
Well, it's just crazy to me that they can't. Like, if you want to leave somewhere, you should be able to leave.
Well, yeah, but
why are you going to be imprisoned to live somewhere?
Well, I mean, that's the problem with, a lot of places around the world. I'm not going to go into detail on it. It's a different video, but an example of that is what people are arguing in Gaza taking place, right? Whether that's true or not, I'm not going to get into it, but I'm just saying your argument is if you want to leave, you should be able to, right? But there are a lot of things that go on sometimes inside the country which won't allow that to take place, or maybe it's a terrorist state, and then all of a sudden, though, that becomes more difficult, blah, 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 blah. Anyways, my point was just that, that's how things are probably not going in the right direction if people are trying to leave.
Yeah.
And beyond that, we're starting to see and getting to the time frame where, the Berlin Wall comes to be and comes down, right? So I think obviously it's crazy how that has gotten so far into Europe, right? Initiating from the Soviet Union and how it kind of took place and how it took so long to get into the inner workings of Europe. We saw like Poland and stuff like that, slowly making the changes after Soviet Union made the changes. But it's like it got so deep into certain areas that it took longer and longer to get rid of the influence that was there. So pretty mind blowing to know that, you know, there was so much influence and it can have a third, fourth, fifth order effect, right?
For sure, and take so long to move in the other direction.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
The biggest dissent was growing. Over time, demonstrations turned to mass protest, with plainclothes secret police officers doing their best to put down the dissent, but it had grown well out of their control. And worse, the biggest demonstration was yet to come. We're gonna put all of this down by force. Right, guys? Guys? Unfortunately, everyone had realized what he had not. This was bigger than them, and the entire East German Politburo voted him out of power. On November 4th, over 500,000 East Germans took to the streets of East Berlin. For many, there was still one big target left in their sights: that damn wall. The pressure on the East German government was too great, and on November 9th, they made a bit of a chaotic announcement that the travel ban between East and West was being lifted. The change wasn't meant to take effect until the next day, and crossing guards still had orders to shoot on sight any who tried to cross. But that night, huge crowds gathered at the crossing points, and the guards were overwhelmed. In an astronomically historic moment, after decades of family separation and travel restriction, the people were allowed to pass through. East and West Berliners couldn't believe it and celebrated together throughout the night. Some even climbed the wall and began to topple it. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and a year later, Germany would be reunited. Elections in Bulgaria, a peaceful revolution in Czechoslovakia, and a violent one in Romania brought to an end communist authority in the Eastern Bloc. America decided it would be best if it just stayed away and let the change happen, as the anti-communist movement continued all the way back to Moscow. Gorbachev had given the people the freedom to demonstrate. Now, they demonstrated for an end to the communist single-party rule, and Gorbachev had to give in. For the first time in history, elections were held in which candidates not officially endorsed by the party were allowed to run. Ambitious rival of Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, led a growing democratic movement. Now things here get quite confusing, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a complicated topic, so believe me, this is oversimplified, but it went a little bit like this. The Soviet Union was made up of a number of smaller Soviet republics, the largest of which was Russia. Yeltsin got himself elected the president of Russia, and began a struggle for sovereignty against Gorbachev and the greater Soviet Union. Communist hardliners were horrified at what Gorbachev was allowing, so they briefly kidnapped him and tried to set up their own emergency government. But Yeltsin and his supporters all gathered around the White House in Moscow and were like, no, we have a tank. So the hardliners had to concede and released Gorbachev. Wow, thanks Boris. That was a close one. No problem. And thanks to you for all the great freedom you've given us. Anytime, pal. And just to inform you, I've used that freedom you've given us to go behind your back and make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union and set up the Russian Federation. In other words, you're no longer in charge. I am. Dude. So uncool. And so decades of tension and the everlasting threat of nuclear war finally came to an end as democratic governments were established in many of the old Soviet republics. And the world got along together forever after. Right, guys? Hey, this modern art thing is growing on me. Where can I learn to do that? Skillshare.
So a nice way to end that one there. A nice visual of all those guys, those wonderful leaders on the. They're definitely different than the other ones previously, for sure. They're not all the same.
Yeah.
But it is, pretty remarkable to see. Obviously, we mentioned Gorbachev, and we talked about how that led into Europe and the changes that took place. But I wonder if people look at that, if you're a leader, right, and you look at that and say Gorbachev gave them the ability to be more vocal, use their voice, protest, demonstrate, all that stuff, right? Then we see the result of that, right? It ended with people walking into East and West Berlin and reuniting with each other, the reunification of Germany as a whole. And so clearly, this is something that there was so much tension for so long, but it all started, well, maybe not, from the foundations, but it basically started from Gorbachev allowing people to demonstrate in the Soviet Union, right? And then it made its way all the way to Germany. So my point is that I wonder we're seeing what's going on today, and people are trying to control power and grab power, and particularly in the United States, you see the role of the left versus the right, and it becoming so polarized.
Yeah.
Right. And what I've started to notice is that governments, are starting to crack down a little bit more, and from watching this, you can see when you give people the ability to demonstrate and speak and have conversations and see what's out there, then they feel more empowered, right? And they take more power away from government, right? And the governments realize, no, there's nothing we can do about it. This is what the people want. This is what we have to do. Whereas in contrast, we saw in the beginning, it was much more controlled. It was the leaders making the decision. The people felt helpless because they were confined to not feel like they had an outlet to do anything with.
Yeah.
So if you're somebody in today's world, you're going to look at it and say, well, we need to take away rights, freedoms, and all that from
from
people.
a perspective of a leader.
Right.
Yeah.
And that way we can control them more, and then the people are going to feel like they don't have any say in what goes on. So for me, I think that's why as I get older, I understand the perspective that rights and freedoms matter. They are very, very essential because of what's happened, particularly with communism.
Yeah, you can see it right here.
In the past, that it was something that, really, really influenced the world in a negative way. It should be that people are employing government officials and they're doing what the people want, not vice versa.
Yeah, for sure. No, I totally agree with that. And for me, I have a hard time wrapping my head around, just because we recently watched that movie Oppenheimer, right, where they talked a lot about the Communist Party in the US, right, and people supporting that. And I just especially after seeing this, I just don't understand how somebody could want to support that.
Yeah, I think it's, there are definitely nuance in the ideas, because there are people that can make arguments as to why they support something with some valid reasons in them. But I think, the general, when you look at the generalized idea, it's very easy to see why, the people that take hold of the system will use it to their advantage, right?
For sure.
So anyways, your thoughts, closing thoughts on Cold War?
I thought it was really cool to see. I didn't know 90% of this. I never really learned much in depth about the Cold War. And again, right, I just feel like these videos do a really great job at educating you, but not overwhelming you to the point where you kind of don't retain any of the information or get overstimulated and it's hard to follow. I feel like it's really easy to follow. They have the comedy in there to keep it a little bit lighthearted and keep you engaged. So I thought it was great.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this one from the Cold War for sure. I learned a lot. Some of it was tying pieces together for me of certain aspects that I had heard, but didn't really know where they fell into in terms of timelines or people or countries or whatever. So this really tied it all together for me in a great way, and I really, really appreciated that. So if you guys want to let us know in the comments where we should go next, if you have a recommendation as to what big events might resonate with a larger aspect of the community, we'd appreciate the insights. And make sure you hit the like button if you did enjoy this one. If you first time on the channel here and you want to join us on this journey of history, but that's not the only thing we have. We have some music, comedy, and sports as well. So if you like all that kind of stuff, this is the place to be. We'd love to have you.
Lots to choose from.
Yeah. So hit that subscribe button and notification bell, and we'll see you in our next video, which will be tomorrow.
Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you then.